The day I buried my father, Deborah Witherspoon served me a citation. By sunset, her HOA-approved bulldozers were at my property line. But when she torched my family's 30-year-old hunting lodge to build her gluten-free yoga retreat, she forgot one thing. Sheriff badges outrank clipboard tyrants. And the footage from my game cameras? Let's just say her rustic chic arson looks way less charming in 4K. Dad carved the lodge's doorframe from the oak that survived the '77 tornado, the same storm that took his brother. Every splinter in those walls held our history. 3 days after Dad's funeral, I found shiny survey markers in the creek and later discovered Deborah had already pitched her dream project, Sycamore Bluffs Luxury Glamping, to potential investors with my land as the crown jewel. She didn't ask, didn't negotiate. She just stuck those bright flags into the dirt as if our family legacy was nothing but an inconvenient speed bump. That's when I knew I was dealing with a special kind of tyrant, the kind who thinks boundary lines are suggestions rather than laws. To understand why a Gaskin would eventually become my Exhibit A, we start where most Karen sagas do, a clipboard and a god complex. I'm the sheriff of Quiet County, nestled in the Appalachian foothills. We've got sprawling forests and winding back roads, the sort of place where folks wave when they pass you, whether they like you or not. I spent 20 years in the military, then returned home to care for my father after his first stroke. He passed last spring, leaving me the land and the hunting lodge he'd built over 3 decades with his own hands. He always said that lodge was his cathedral, and now I understand. It wasn't just lumber and nails, it was a testament to our family's grit, carved from the same stubbornness that kept us going after every storm. Enter Deborah Witherspoon. Newly divorced, out for vengeance, and the self-appointed president of the Sycamore Bluff HOA. She strutted around like she was the official steward of everything in sight, brandishing a Lexus that had likely never seen a dirt road. She wore that plastic grin that said any problem could be solved with a form, a fine, or a passive-aggressive newsletter. I'd seen her around the cul-de-sac near my property a couple of times, never gave her much thought, never guessed she'd decide my father's lodge was an eyesore. But that's how these people operate. They latch onto a perceived violation, then swarm like hornets until they wear you down. My lodge is about 10 feet outside the HOA boundary, 10 measly feet between me and her imaginary kingdom. But that didn't stop her from marching onto my porch one Saturday, clipboard in hand like it was the 10 Commandments. I was in the middle of fixing a storm shutter when I heard the telltale clack of her heels on gravel. She cleared her throat, introduced herself as Deborah, the HOA president, and informed me that my structure was not in compliance with Sycamore Bluff's guidelines, something about unapproved logs, visible wood piles, and other nonsense that apparently degraded the community aesthetic. I said, "Ma'am, this lodge has been here since before half of those suburban houses were on the map, so let's be clear, I am not in your HOA." She tightened her smile and handed me a stapled packet, referencing Section 8 for structure visibility, landscaping, and color palettes. She acted like those typed-out pages were written by the Almighty. I told her plainly that my father built this place with his bare hands in 1980-something, and unless her bylaws were signed by God himself, they didn't apply to me. She insisted I was adjacent, and therefore a visual impact, but I wasn't budging. Finally, she stomped off, muttering about property values. I assumed that was the end of it. Turns out it was just the opening salvo. A week later, brand new, private HOA residence only signs appeared along the gravel road leading to my place. They looked official, laminated, staked in neat rows, each bearing a knockoff HOA logo. One even blocked the wooden marker my dad had carved decades ago that read, "Welcome to Fox Hollow." I tore those signs down and burned them in the fire pit. By the next morning, they were back. Then came the fines. Crisp white envelopes with that same phony letterhead. Violation, unauthorized structure. Violation, unapproved fire pit. Violation, wildlife attractant. Apparently my habit of leaving corn out for deer was now a criminal offense, according to Deborah. Again, I wasn't in her HOA. So I filed a cease and desist, citing property law, zoning maps, and the obvious boundary line that ended well before my land began. I even offered to meet her civilly to clear up misunderstandings. She responded by forwarding my infractions to the local utility company, claiming my lodge was an uninhabited safety hazard. Next thing I knew, the power got cut. I had to fax in my land deeds and a dozen other documents before they'd restore electricity. If you think I scared easily, you don't know me. Dad taught me how to handle bullies by outlasting them. So I bided my time, collecting every piece of incriminating evidence she tossed my way, the letters, the fake signs, the neighbor testimonies. I hoped she'd eventually get bored, that she'd find some other poor soul's mailbox flowers to harass. Instead, she escalated. One morning, I found fresh tire tracks behind my tool shed, leading straight to a heap of contractor trash dumped in the creek, drywall, paint cans, random scraps. I reported it and cleaned it up myself. Then I hammered a large wooden post at the property line with a clear warning, private land. No entry. Violators will be prosecuted. The next day, my sign was gone, replaced by a plastic one that read, future site of Sycamore Bluffs Nature Park, sponsored by your HOA. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just running a power trip. She was plotting a land grab. My father's lodge would be flattened for her curated nature retreat, complete with yoga decks and gluten-free picnic tables if she had her way. But the final straw that set the stage for war was the wedding tent. She never asked. She just drove onto my soybean field with trucks full of catering equipment and a $220,000 rental marquee that looked like a royal pavilion. Said her niece was having a rustic ceremony. Claimed the county had given verbal approval, which was news to me. They hammered stakes into my soil, unrolled carpets over my sprouting crops, and set up rows of white chairs like it was a magazine shoot. Then the caterer had the gall to ask if I could move my tractor because it was ruining the aesthetic. I thought, ever seen an HOA president try to bribe a fire marshal with gluten-free brownies? Spoiler alert, it's not a Hallmark movie. I didn't actually say that out loud, but I sure thought it. Instead, I calmly flipped the switch on my manure spreaders, and, well, the rest was comedic legend. If you think a little manure scared her off, though, you don't know Karen's. While everyone was busy freaking out about the sudden shower of fertilizer, I got a call from the fire department. A blaze had erupted in the woods near my lodge. And in my gut, I already knew who was responsible. If you've ever had that sinking feeling in your stomach, the kind that tells you something precious is being destroyed, then you know exactly what I felt as I rushed toward the ridge. Smoke cut across the sky like a funeral banner. The taste of ash hit the back of my throat long before I saw the flames. By the time I arrived, 30 years of my father's legacy had gone up in a storm of embers. The porch collapsed in on itself, the chimney stood alone like a gravestone, and the old elk head from my 12th birthday hunt was nothing but ash. The fire chief, Charlie, said they'd found a gas can hidden behind some brush and multiple accelerant trails. Not an accident, not lightning. Arson. And there were footprints, brand new tactical boots, size 8 or 9. My mind flashed to Deborah strutting around the local Army surplus store 2 days before, showing off her couture combat wear. She must have thought she was on some special ops mission to purge the land of anything that didn't fit her plastic vision. But she overlooked one crucial detail: fire can't destroy cloud storage. After she'd cut my power that first time, I installed wildlife cams and motion-triggered backups all around the property. That footage got saved online the moment it was recorded. So after the ashes cooled, I sat down with my laptop at the station. Sure enough, there she was, lurking in camo gear, toting a bright red gas can around the perimeter of the lodge, dumping liquid along the base, and lighting a rag like she was opening the Olympic Games. She watched for a moment, then fled. Didn't even try covering her face. Just pure arrogance. By all rights, I could have arrested her on the spot. But this wasn't just about me. She'd been screwing with the entire neighborhood, sending bogus fines, forging documents, pushing expansions that weren't approved by anyone but her reflection in the mirror. So I took my time and built a bulletproof case. Gathered phone records, credit card statements, gas station security footage. interviewed the neighbors she'd terrorized over wind chimes, bird baths, or the wrong shade of mailbox paint. Every story painted the same picture: Deborah flaunting imaginary authority, fueled by a sense of entitlement that would shame even the greediest tyrant. Then I made a bigger discovery. The HOA bylaws she kept waving around like scripture had never been officially filed with the county. She'd bullied or scared away the original board members, forging their resignations, forging new charters, forging basically everything. She declared herself the eternal president without an election. People complied out of exhaustion, out of fear she'd bury them in lawsuits. They were busy with actual lies, while she turned her HOA rulebook into a personal set of commandments. One of the most eye-opening testimonies came from her own niece, who felt guilty about the wedding fiasco and wanted to come clean. She told me Deborah's grand plan was to pitch a full-scale wellness retreat across the entire forested section of my land: spa huts, guided hikes, that sort of nonsense. My father's lodge was the only thing in her way, so if it burned down, she assumed I'd cut my losses, sell, and disappear. She counted on me being just another backwoods redneck with no will to fight. She had no clue she was dealing with a former military man who happened to be the county sheriff. But I still held back. I wanted her to keep digging her own grave. Every phony sign she planted, every threatening letter she sent, every piece of unfiled paperwork she tried to push. Then she made the fatal mistake. She filed an official permit application claiming my burned property was conditionally annexed into the HOA. She'd even forged deeds to paint my land as the HOA's community zen garden. That gave me the last piece of the puzzle I needed. Not only was it arson, not only was it fraud, she was now on paper declaring ownership of land she'd just torched. I didn't merely want to arrest her. I wanted to bring her entire cardboard empire crashing down in front of every neighbor she'd harassed. So I dug deeper, pulled her personal finances, learned she used shady contractors paid in cash for under-the-table deals, checked zoning complaints, discovered she disproportionately targeted older folks who couldn't fight back, single moms with no time to navigate legal red tape, and families too busy to challenge her. She was a vulture, but now she was cornered. Her reaction? She went on the offensive. Sent out newsletters calling me aggressive, antisocial, and corrupt. Held a mandatory community meeting where she passed around a petition demanding my removal as sheriff. She even printed signs: "No law above the HOA." If she thought that would intimidate me, she didn't realize how petty it all looked to the rest of the county. Then she tried to break into my lodge's ruins again, presumably to measure restoration costs and finalize her dream boardwalk or whatever it was. I caught her on camera once more, and this time I confronted her personally, told her she was trespassing on private property. In that moment, I saw the flash of panic in her eyes. She didn't think it would go this far. The following morning, I walked into the county courthouse and filed the arrest warrant myself: arson, vandalism, filing false claims, harassment, fraudulent legal documents, impersonating an official, wire tampering. The list was longer than some rap sheets I'd seen for career criminals. The judge signed off without blinking, but before we served it, I quietly called a few neighbors she'd tormented, asked if they wanted to watch. A bunch of them showed up with lawn chairs and popcorn, ready for the show. Deborah was hosting another of her infamous meetings in her manicured front yard when I arrived with my deputies. She had clipboards laid out, HOA banners on display, that same smug posture. She was in mid-sentence about someone's illegal hedge height when I called her name. She turned around, smiled in annoyance, until she saw my uniform and the crowd gathering behind me. I read the charges and the smile vanished. She yelled, "You can't arrest me. I'm the president." She flung her arms wide as if to shield herself with some invisible force field of self-importance. I calmly held up the signed warrant. Neighbors started applauding, cheering, and someone blared the national anthem from a Bluetooth speaker. One of my deputies leaned over and whispered, "Should we also get her for the wedding tent fiasco?" I just grinned and said, "Oh, I'm just getting started." Court day arrived sooner than I expected, probably because the evidence was overwhelming. Deborah came dressed in a beige pantsuit that screamed, "I'm innocent," flanked by a bargain bin lawyer who must have realized too late that the gravy train was about to derail. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the important faces were there. Miss Lorna with photos of her bird bath that Deborah had declared an unapproved water feature, Bill with printouts of his holiday lights that apparently offended her sense of mailbox decorum, and a half dozen others clutching stacks of bogus spines and forged signatures. Deborah tried to spin the arson as a simple misunderstanding, something about clearing brush and accidentally spilling gas. Claimed the lodge was abandoned, and she was doing the community a favor by eliminating a hazard. Her lawyer babbled about administrative oversights and civic duty, but once the wildlife cam footage played, Deborah in camouflage, gleefully dumping accelerant around my father's lodge, there was no question of guilt. Only how severe her punishment would be. The judge even had the bailiff rewind it, letting the entire courtroom witness her lighting that rag a second time in stark detail. The hush was absolute. Her own lawyer just looked at the floor, as if maybe he could tunnel to freedom. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood felt like it had finally awakened from a bad dream. The weekend after her sentencing, they threw a barbecue, ribs, cornbread, coleslaw, kids running barefoot in the yard, no clipboards in sight. Miss Lorna brought me a plate and said it felt like the end of a very long winter. I nodded. It was exactly that, a thaw, a return to normalcy. People shared stories about how Deborah had tried to scare them with threats of legal action for the most minor violations. Now those nightmares were over, as if a cloud of fear had finally burned away. As for my lodge, I rebuilt it. Not exactly the same, because some things can't be restored to their original state. But I used fireproof materials where I could, reinforced the frame, added solar panels, and constructed a stone fire pit that was 1,000 times safer and more efficient than the old setup. I carved a new sign in the style Dad taught me, simple, sturdy. Underneath Fox Hollow Lodge, I engraved, Karen-proof since 2024. It might be a touch petty, but it makes me smile, and I think Dad would have appreciated the humor. The rest of the area around the lodge I left to the wildflowers, letting the forest reclaim a bit of the ground she tried to take. Deborah's court-ordered community service placed her in the county maintenance program, scraping graffiti off picnic tables and hosing down public restrooms in the park she once tried to fence off. I drove by once, saw her wearing a fluorescent vest and holding a power washer. A bunch of teenagers recognized her from the viral wedding fiasco and started recording. She tried to hide her face, but one kid yelled, "Aren't you that lady who burned down a forest for a yoga retreat?" The look she gave them hovered between fury and despair. Almost made me pity her. Almost. She still writes letters now and then, long rants claiming she was framed, misunderstood, or politically targeted. None of them go anywhere because every agency she contacts already has the same mountain of evidence. Every judge she tries to appeal to has watched that damning footage of her pouring gasoline around my father's lodge. Her name is mud, and nobody's stepping in to save her. I don't give it a second thought anymore. I prefer to spend my time up at the new lodge, listening to birds in the morning, sipping coffee on the porch as the sun cracks through the pines. Sometimes the fog rolls in a certain way, reminding me of smoke. But this smoke doesn't come to destroy. It's just nature being beautiful. Occasionally, people ask if I regret not arresting her sooner, if I wish I'd put my foot down the minute she showed up, high heels on gravel, wielding her clipboard. In some alternate reality, maybe I would have. But I'm glad I waited. Because it wasn't just about punishing her, it was about making sure everyone like her understood that you can't bully or con your way into power without eventually facing the consequences. Sometimes the law moves slow, but when it hits like a sledgehammer. After the sentencing, I rebuilt a memorial bench for Dad, bolting it down twice as securely as before. Stained it darker, made sure it would outlast any storm. Sometimes I sit there and reflect on how a single stubborn person with too much time on her hands can wreak havoc. But I also think about how a community, once aware, can rally together to push back against that same tyranny. That's what happened here. We overcame. She lost everything. I gained peace. Last month, Deborah's probation officer found her sneaking onto my land again, apparently to measure the new lodge's porch. Old habits die hard. Good thing motion-activated sprinklers don't. She got a soaked outfit and a swift warning not to set foot on my property again. I doubt she learned the lesson, but that's no longer my problem. When someone new moves in and asks, "Whatever happened to the Sycamore Bluff HOA?" I just grin, point toward the hills, and say, they picked the wrong property to mess with. Then I offer them coffee. No forms, fines, or intimidation. Just neighbors, the way it ought to be.